Well, 2 generations before I was born, something happened that had a huge impact on my life. My grandpa heard the gospel and believed in Jesus. And it changed his life. And because of that, my mom was raised in a Christian home. And as a result, I was raised in a Christian home. I grew up hearing and being taught to follow Jesus. Well, my grandpa may have been a poor man, but he left a priceless heritage. And shortly before my grandpa died, he called me. And I think I've mentioned this to you once before. But shortly before he died, he called me and he gave me a blessing or a charge. And I'm going to read you what he said to me. He told me, "Be faithful, because he is faithful. God is near. He's only a breath away. No, closer. He's in our very being." He called and talked to me one last time to tell me what matters most. Today we're going to read from 1Chronicles. Now, 1 and 2 Chronicles is a separate account of the same history that we find in Samuel and Kings. And so it's the same history, but they have some different details. And so today we're going to back up a little bit from where we left off last week in 1 Kings to a time when just before David dies. And David gives a public charge to his son Solomon. So we begin in chapter 28 in verse 1. We see David's charge to Solomon. It says, David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the officials of the tribes, the officers of the divisions that served the king, and the commanders of the thousands, the commanders of hundreds, the stewards of all the property and livestock of the king and his sons, together with the palace officials, the mighty men, and all the seasoned warriors. Then King David rose to his feet and said, and I have to think that's kind of impressive because remember, David was very ill or weak. He was on his bed, but he rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood." Let's stop there for a minute. So David has already told Solomon privately to build a temple. You could find that if you turned back to 1 Chronicles chapter 22. So he's already told him that he is to build the temple for God. But now he publicly assigns this task. And this is going to be a big building project, and it will require careful attention, and it will be expensive. And so it requires that all of the leaders of Israel are on board with this, that they know that it's going to happen, that it's supposed to happen, and that they are to take part in this. So everyone needs to be on board. But they will also need people to oversee the work. They will need people who can manage the funding, and they will need people who can provide security during this building project. So David calls together the representatives of all the people, including leaders from each of the tribes, royal officials, and leaders from the military. So he calls all these people together, and he starts by telling them the history of his plan to build this temple for God. But before we get to that, the idea of a temple goes back a little further in history than where David starts. You see, after God delivered Israel from Egypt, yes, it goes all the way back to the Exodus. After God delivered Israel from Egypt, he told them through Moses that when they came into the promised land and were settled there, that there would be a centralized place to worship God. That means they were all going to come to one place to worship. Now, there were other locations where people might worship locally, and we see that. In fact, later on, some of those local places of worship had to be torn down because people started worshiping idols there. But God says there would be one centralized place to worship him. One place where the Ark of the Covenant would be kept, and where the burnt offerings and certain things like that would be done. But along with this plan for a centralized place of worship, God also gave them the instructions for the tabernacle. And if you were here when we studied through Exodus, you will remember that. And so God gave them the instructions for the tabernacle, which was a central place of worship like the temple was. But it was portable. And why was it portable? Because the people of Israel were moving around. They were traveling. And so it was a tent, just like the people of Israel at that time were living in tents. So after Israel settled in the land, and they had permanent houses of their own, it was at this point that David thought to himself, God should have a permanent house as well. There should be a place to permanently keep the Ark of the Covenant. And that's why he actually calls the temple a house of rest for the Ark. Why? Because the Ark is no longer traveling. It's in one place. He said, let's put it in one place, that centralized place. So David wanted to build a house for God. And specifically, it's a place for the Ark. And David calls it here God's footstool. You see, because the Ark pictured the presence of God. And in this, you have the picture of God being enthroned above the Ark and him reaching out and resting his feet on the Ark. It was his footstool. And so it symbolized that God was present there with his people. But God told David that he could not build the temple. But he said, but your son Solomon will build the temple. But David made many preparations, and he drew up the plans, and he collected materials. But we have to ask a question. Why was it that David was not allowed to build the temple, but Solomon would be allowed to build the temple? Well, it says here it's because David had killed many people in battle. When we read that, though, it kind of sounds like David then is unworthy, or like he's done something wrong because he has killed people in battle. And because of that, some have tried to say, well, really, it's because he had Uriah killed. Or somehow they might try and connect it to the premature deaths of his sons. I don't know how they get that, but some people try and do that. But the thing is what is very clear is that this is tied to the fact that he was in war and that he fought in battle, that these killings happened in battle. In fact, chapter 22 states it very clearly. Let me read you just a few verses from chapter 22. It says, but the word of the Lord came to me saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. And so David was a man of war and had killed many people in battle. But that in itself was not wrong. In fact, why did David fight battles? Because God told him to. As king, that was his responsibility to secure the land for Israel, to take the land and secure it. And so he was actually doing what God had assigned to him as king. And so why is it that God says, because you're a man of bloodshed, because you have killed, you're a man of war, you can't build my temple? Well, I think in part it's simply the fact that God values life. And that God, so a king who has killed many people, even legitimately in battle, is disqualified from building a temple in his name. So it involves God's holiness, his purity, the fact that he is set apart. But I think there's something else going on here as well. The verses we just read from chapter 22 said that Solomon would build the temple because he would be a man of peace. But the specific words that he used for Solomon is that he would be a man of rest, because the land would be secured and they would be at rest from all of their enemies. So during his reign, the land is secure and they have peace. Now let me read for you from Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 8 to 12. You can turn there if you would like to, but I'll read it for you. This is where God had told Israel that you would have a centralized place of worship. This is what he says. God is speaking through Moses, and Moses says, "You shall not do accordingly to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes, for you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God has given you." What he's saying is, you're not going to keep worshiping just the way you're doing it now. You're not where everyone just kind of does whatever they want, wherever they want, however they want. He said, that's about to change. He says, verse 10, he says, "But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God." He says, when God gives you rest from all your enemies around. And in the 1 Chronicles 22 passage we read, it said that Solomon was a man of rest. Why? Because God will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. It's the same idea. You see, David's reign was a time of war. His reign was a time of securing the land. But Solomon's time, his reign was a time of peace, of rest. Because God had given them the land, secured the land. And so now is the time to build the temple. They're secure in the land. God has given them rest. And so this being the case, the temple also would stand then as a reminder that God had given them this land and had given them rest. That God had fulfilled his promises. And a reminder that that land and that security that they have is because of God, who is with them. And then it's also a reminder that they need to remain faithful to this God who is with them. Well, David continues on with his charge. Verse 4, back in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 4. He says, "Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. For he chose Judah as leader, and in the house of Judah, my father's house. And among my father's sons, he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon, my son, to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, it is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish his kingdom forever, if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today." And so here David is simply saying, of all the 12 tribes of Israel, God chose Judah to be the leader. And out of all the families of the tribe of Judah, he chose Jesse's family. And of all the sons in Jesse's family, he chose David. And of all of David's sons, he chose Samuel. And God wants Samuel to build the temple. David is simply making that point. This is God's decision. This isn't just something I want to do. This isn't just something Solomon wants to do. This is God's decision. He has chosen chosen Solomon and wants Solomon to build this temple. So having established that God chose Solomon to build, David now gives his charge. And there's really two parts to this charge. The first part is to all the people of Israel. We find that in verse 8. He says, "Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance to your children after you forever." Basically, he tells the people of Israel to fully obey God. And he says, and if you do, you will possess the land and pass it on to your descendants. Now, this is an interesting statement that he makes, given the fact that they are now in the land. They possess the land. And this is a time of peace and security. But David says this as a reminder to them that it could be taken away from them. Or maybe more accurately, they could be taken out of the land. So in order for them to possess it, they must be obedient. It is theirs to possess, but they have to be faithful to God to continue to possess it. And so he says, obey God. And as you obey God, you enjoy his promised blessings. Well, then he turns to Solomon in verse 9. He says, "And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it." So he tells Solomon to be faithful to God. He says, know God, meaning have an intimate knowledge of him. Live in relationship with him. And he tells him to serve God with a whole heart and a willing mind. In other words, live for God sincerely. Live for him joyfully and with all that you are. See, that's what matters most. And that's what he tells Solomon. Do this. That's what matters most. And he adds that God knows everything, even your innermost thoughts. And so if Solomon truly seeks after God, if Solomon truly follows God, then God will be there for him and God will help him. But if Solomon turns away from God, he should not expect the support of God. And then he gives that final challenge. He says to be careful. And he says, be strong and do it, which reemphasizes the need to do what's right. Reemphasizes that need to do what God has told him to do. Make sure that you are faithful to God. And for Solomon, this included the task of building the temple because God had chosen him to do it. Well, let's keep reading verse 11. Then David gave Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple and its houses, its treasuries, its upper rooms, and its inner chambers, and of the room for the mercy seat, and the plan for all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers, the treasuries of the house of God, and the treasuries for dedicated gifts, for the divisions of the priests and of the Levites, and all the work of the service in the house of the Lord, for all the vessels for the service in the house of the Lord, the weight of gold for all the golden vessels for each service, the weight of silver vessels for each service, the weight of the golden lampstands and their lamps, the weight of the gold for each lampstand and its lamps, the weight of the silver for a lampstand and its lamps, according to the use of each lampstand in the service. The weight of gold for each table for the showbread, the silver for the silver tables, the pure gold for the forks, the basins and the cups, for the golden bowls and the weight of each, for the silver bowls and the weight of each, for the altar of incense made of refined gold and its weight, and its plan for the golden chariot of the cherubim that spread their wings and covered the ark of the covenant of the Lord. All this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord. All the work is to be done according to this plan. Now, this is a paragraph that oftentimes when we're reading through the Bible, we say, okay, details. But there's a few important points to note here, some significant things to note. First of all, the plans here cover the building, the layout of the building, the furnishings that would be used in the temple worship, and the people who would serve in the temple. Secondly, the plans are very specific. He even gives the weights of the materials to be used. So it's this much gold or this much silver. And so it's very specific, which suggests that everything must be made precisely, just as the plan states. And then thirdly, we read that the plans are actually from God. That this is not just David's idea, but David received these plans through a revelation from God. Well, let's keep reading then. Verse 20. It says, "Then David said to Solomon his son, 'Be strong and courageous and do it. Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God, even my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. And behold, the divisions of the priests and the Levites for all the service of the house of God. And with you in all the work will be every willing man who has skill for any kind of service. Also the officers and all the people will be holy at your command.'" Now, building this temple for God could be a daunting task. I mean, think about this. The responsibility alone could weigh heavily upon a person. I mean, first of all, this temple will represent God's presence with his people. And this will be a place where the people of Israel will go to maintain their fellowship with God and to worship God. And God himself gave the plans. So it has to be done just right. And it has to be done to honor God. And so because of the fact of this weight, that it could be a daunting task, David encourages young Solomon. And he uses the same words that God told Joshua when Joshua was to go in and take the land. He says, "Be strong and courageous." You see, he tells him that God is with him. There's no reason for him to be afraid or to be discouraged because God is with him. And not only that, he says there's help from other people as well. You don't have to do this all on your own. And he says these people are already in place and they're ready to help and they have skills and they know how to do those things that you might not know how to do. And when we read this, this is a great encouragement even for us today. See, when God gives you something to do, he provides what you need to do it. When you're walking with God, God is right beside you. I think we need to remind ourselves of that sometimes. When we get fearful, when we get discouraged, God's right here. He's with us. And he gives what we need to do what he has called us to do. Also, when we see this, we have a great example of God's people working together. And if you are a young person or a young believer, you need to know that you're not alone. You don't have to do everything all by yourself. But there are believers who will walk with you, who will help you. There are people who know things that you don't know yet. And I guess young is relative. Because I am younger than some. And I know there are some who know more than I do. But we need to remember that we are not alone. And on top of that, we also need to be ready to help each other. That if you have skills, if you know things, if you have abilities, that you are ready to help others live for God and do what he has called them to do. Now, if they're going to build this temple, they need some materials. So look what happens. Chapter 29, verse 1. It says, "And David, the king, said to all the assembly, Solomon, my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the palace," when it says palace, he's referring to the temple, because it's the house of God. "The palace will not be for man, but for the Lord God." And so David is laying it out right here. This is what makes this building so significant. This is what makes this project so weighty, is that the fact that it's not being made for people, it's being made for God. This isn't about David. It's not a building in honor of Solomon. It's for God. This won't honor a king, a person, but will honor God. It will be his house. And on top of that, Solomon is young and inexperienced. And David is not criticizing him for that. He is just stating a fact. And he's saying this isn't going to be easy. So look what he did. Verse 2. "So I have provided for the house of my God so far as I was able, the gold for the things of gold, the silver for the things of silver, the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, and wood for the things of wood, besides great quantities of onyx and stones for setting, antimony, colored stones, all sorts of precious stones, and marble. Moreover, in addition to all that, I have provided for the holy house. I have a treasure of my own of gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of my God, I give it to the house of my God. 3,000 talents of gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house, and for all the work to be done by craftsmen, gold for the things of gold and silver for the things of silver. Who then will offer willingly, consecrate himself today to the Lord?" And so David is saying here that he has done as much as he could to help. He has collected materials over the years for building the temple. And that includes some common metals like iron and bronze, but also precious metals, gold and silver. It includes precious stones and other kinds of gems. It included marble and included wood. So he's collected these things. But those things would have been from the royal collection. And then he adds, "And I have my own personal offering." And so he gave from his own belongings. So David tells us what he gave out of his own pocket. He says that he gave, how many talents? 5,000 talents, 3,000 talents, different things. A talent is about 75 pounds. Okay? So that means he gave about 110 tons, that's 220,000 pounds of pure gold. And now, someone smarter than me worked this all out back in 2015. So at the values in 2015, that would have been about $396 million worth of gold. David also gave 260 tons of silver. So the value would have been about $126 million worth of silver. And so just the gold and the silver would have totaled about $572 million. And David said, "Here, that's my offering out of my pocket, plus whatever else he gave." Now, why did he give so much? Well, David tells us. He says, "Because my devotion to the house of my God." He gave it because he was devoted to this temple of God. And his devotion to the house of God came from his devotion to God. That's what he says, to the house of my God. It's because he was devoted to God. He gave because he was devoted to God. It was worship. That's what David is saying. I'm giving all this because God is worth it. It's worship. And in this we see again David's heart for God. He did all that he could to provide for the house of God in order to honor God. Now, David did this, and when he did this, he set the example for giving, and then he challenged the rest of the people to give. He says, "Who else is willing?" And now, they may not be able to give each of those individuals as much as the king, but that wasn't the issue. The point here is that God is worthy of much. So David gave much. And then he asks, and who else is willing? Who else would give willingly to honor God? So they didn't have to, but he gave them the opportunity. And he gave them the opportunity to follow his example and to worship God in this way. Now, just as a side note, I know a lot of people don't like talking about money, but I'm going to do it. But as a side note, speaking of leading by examples, I don't know if you know this, but in order to be an elder here at First Baptist, you have to give to the church. The amount, I have no idea what anybody gives. But I know that our elders, myself included, we all give to support the ministry of this church. If you don't, you can't be an elder. Because this is one way that we express the honor that is due to God. This is one way that we express that God is worthy. It's a way that we worship, and this is a way that we lead by example. Now look what happens when David says, who's willing? Verse 6. Then the leaders of the father's house made their free will offerings, as did also the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of thousands and of the hundreds and the officers over the king's work. They gave for the service of the house of God 5,000 talents and 10,000 derricks of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And whoever had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord, and in the care of Jehiel the Gershonite. Then the people rejoiced because they had given willingly, for with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. And so what happened? They all followed David's example, and they give generously and sacrificially. They give about 190 tons of gold. Again, the value would be about $652,442,000. They give 375 tons of silver, a value of about $180 million, for a total of around $832,442,000 worth of gold and silver, plus the other things. This is a huge amount, and a huge amount is amazing. But even more significant is their willing hearts. That they gave because they wanted to. They gave willingly. They wanted to give it to God because it says He's worth it. And then they all rejoice that they were able to give this offering. They are excited that they were able to give, and they are grateful that they had the opportunity to honor God in this way. And David rejoices also. In fact, he's moved by the people's love for God and their willing sacrifice. Now, I just have one thing to say about that. That is cheerful giving. We talk about cheerful giving? That is cheerful giving. Could you imagine with me, if when you gave your offering, you were like so excited that you were like, yes! And you're just like, thank you, God, that you have given me this money so I can give it back to you. You are so awesome, and I just want to praise you. You see, that's the attitude that these people have. That is cheerful giving. And we're told that God loves a cheerful giver. But that is what cheerful giving is. And David is so moved, he's moved to pray, and he publicly praises and thanks God. Look at verse 10. Therefore David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly. And David said, Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. So first of all, David praises God for his greatness, and because he praises him because God has allowed them to begin the building process of the temple with this offering, this great offering. And so what David does when he praises God and he says that he is God and Father of Israel. That is, he is the only God in Israel. Israel's only God, and he is in control. And also he calls him Father. He is caring and supportive of his people like a father, and that there is no end to their relationship. He continues and says about God, he says, there is no one greater. He has all power, and therefore he deserves all praise and all glory, and he is the true king and the true ruler over all things. And he continues, says that if a person is honored or has wealth, it's from God. Because God is in control of all wealth. So specifically, this would apply to this offering that was just given. But he's saying that they had it to give because God gave it to them. And because God gave it to them, they freely gave it back. And then lastly, he again says that God is all powerful. But here he also makes the point that that it is God who elevates people and gives strength to people. And so if I have any strength, if you have any skills, if you have ability, if you have any status, it's from God. He continues on, verse 13. He says, and now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are strangers from before you, and sojourners as our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own. At this point, David recognizes how amazing God's grace is. And he thanks him. And he says, you know what, they were able to give so much because God had blessed them. And giving to God is simply giving back part of what he has given to you. And so it's God's money. You're giving God's money to him because it all belongs to him anyways. And David humbly says, you know, we're nothing special. We're just people who live a short time. But how awesome that we were able to give to God this way. To be able to do this, and we were able to because of God's greatness and because of God's generosity towards us. You see, every good gift is from above. Everything good we have is from God. So think about this. If you have $1 in your pocket, it's God's. But he's given it to you to use. And if we thought correctly about our money like this, if we thought correctly about our abilities like this, if we thought correctly about the positions that we find ourselves in like this, would it have an impact on how we live our lives? Would it have an impact on how we use our money? Would it have an impact on what we do with our time and our position that we hold? My question is, how do you honor God with all that you are and all that you have? It's all his. He's given it to you to use. How will you use it? Verse 17. He says, I know, my God, that you test the heart and have pleasure in uprightness. In the uprightness of my heart, I have freely offered all these things. And now I have seen your people who are present here offering freely and joyously to you. He's saying they've shown through their giving to God that their hearts are right before God. That they have the right attitudes about God and about their stuff. And when your heart is right, it's a joy to give. Verse 18. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, Keep forever such purpose and thoughts in the hearts of your people, and direct their hearts toward you. Grant to Solomon my son a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all, and that he may build the palace for which I have made provision. So he closes his prayer with two requests. The first is that God would keep the hearts of Israel's people right, just like they are on that day. See, he wants them to always be devoted to God, as is evident right now. And then secondly, he prays for Solomon. For Solomon, that Solomon in particular would be faithful and devoted to God. You see, because that is what matters most in his life. Even as king, being faithful to God is what is most important. And he prays that as Solomon is faithful, that God will bless him and enable him to finish the building this temple. And again, here we see David's heart for God. Have you ever thought about this? David longs to see this temple finished, but David will never see it. He won't be around. He's about to die. And could you imagine making all these provisions and all these plans and setting it aside and saying, okay, it's in your hands to do it? I have no idea if you will. But David longs for this, and so he charges and he prays that Solomon will finish, that he will follow through, that he will do this. He longs to see that temple, but he never will. So he prays that Solomon will finish it to the glory of God. So what matters most? Is it buildings or stuff? No. It's not even giving offerings. Although these may show that your heart is right and that what matters most actually does matter most to you. But what matters most is God. What matters most is your relationship with God, that you know him and you are right before him through Jesus Christ. What matters most is that you are faithful to God, that you're devoted to him. What matters most is living to bring honor and glory to our great God. In a world where many voices call out to us, a world where many distractions compete for our attention, in a world where there are many diversions trying to steal our focus away, let us be careful and remember what matters most.